Good evening and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm your host, John Ronan, and as you know, during our half-hour programs each week, I talk to writers about what inspires their craft, how they got there, what they're working on, what their future might bring. We also talk to all kinds of other artists, at least occasionally. We've had actors on, we've had sculptors, we've had painters, all sorts of folks. So we cast a pretty wide net. If you have ideas for writers or other artists who might be looking to be on the show, please send their names in to our address, which appears at the end of the program. I'd also like to remind you that many past episodes of the Writer's Block are available at Sawyer Library. Unfortunately, they're all on VHS tape. So if you have an old machine for VHS, you can go in and take one of the old shows out as you would a book, watch it at home, and then bring it back. I should mention we hope to have the past shows transferred to DVD pretty soon. Tonight's guest is a writer, I'm happy to say, by the name of Dorothy Stevens. She is a memoirist. She's written about some adventures she had in Kenya. Dorothy is a resident right now of Marblehead, although she originally was born and raised in New Jersey, where she attended Douglas College, part of Rutgers University. She moved to Marblehead in 1969 and has been there ever since. Now, before she moved to Marblehead, however, she lived for a time in Kenya, and she has written a book, a memoir of that experience, which was in 2006, a finalist in the Bakeless nonfiction competition at Breadloaf, the very, very famous writers' retreat up in Middlebury, Vermont. The memoir which she wrote is titled Kwaheri, means goodbye, Memories of Kenya, 1957 to 1959. Dorothy Stevens, thanks very much for being on the Writer's Block.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, did I get that right? You were a finalist in the Breadloaf competition
in 1997.
97.
Yes.
I was not
yes.
right. But the book was
published in
2006.
In 2006.
Right. Okay. So it was a finalist right after you wrote it. You were a finalist.
Well, it was
right after you
was
wrote
a different form of this book. It was an early draft. The book has changed a lot in those years because it didn't come out until last year.
In December, I think you said, of
December of 06, right.
I'm going to hold the book up and hopefully hold it so that we get no reflection. Would you say the name of the book again, please, Dorothy?
Kwaheri means goodbye. Memories of Kenya, 1957 to 1959.
Now, would you repeat the African title?
Kwaheri.
Kwaheri. In what language is that?
Swahili.
Swahili. And Kwaheri means goodbye, almost, and it's two words, just as our goodbye. Mm-hmm. Is it an exact translation? Or
I don't know. I don't know.
Tell me about your experience in Kenya. Why did you go to Kenya?
We went to Kenya because my husband was in the Foreign Service. He was a Cultural Affairs Officer for the United States Information Service. And so we went out there for a 2-year posting in 1957.
And where in Kenya were you?
Nairobi.
In the city?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It must have been quite of a culture shock.
It was. I think if you want to know who I was and where I was at the time, I was a typical suburban housewife living outside of Washington, D.C. And the next thing I knew, I was flying across the Atlantic with my husband and 3 children headed for Africa. So that pretty much sums it up.
Did you wonder, what is going on? What am I doing?
I was pretty nervous about going because it was toward the end of Kenya's time as a British colony, so there was lots going on, lots of tumult, lots of change. But it was also the end of the Mau Mau emergency. And they were actually still hunting down some of the freedom fighters in the mountains outside of Nairobi. And then, of course, there was always the question of disease and, are my children going to be safe there? So, yeah, I was nervous.
When did you decide to write the memoir?
You know, I never really decided to write it as a memoir until just not too long ago. I just thought of it as a collection of memories of things I didn't want to forget. And what started it was that probably 25 years ago, I came across a suitcase in the attic that had the letters I had written home to my parents and my husband's parents.
Oh, you kept all of them.
And our mothers kept them and gave them back to me. And I had just put them away in a suitcase in the attic and forgotten all about it. And then I was rummaging around in the attic looking for something one weekend, and I found this suitcase, and I began looking through the letters, and that's when all these memories began kind of pouring out. And I began writing them down, but for years it was just little bits and pieces and scraps of this and that, and I never even thought of it as a book. And the prize at Breadloaf was really not for the whole book, it was for part of I had a manuscript that was sort of part of this book, but it wasn't really complete, and it wasn't what it is today. So it was quite a different piece of work, but a lot of, some of it was in there.
So thank goodness for old-fashioned paper letters, huh?
Yes, we don't do that anymore very much, but it was very useful because it would just trigger things, and every once in a while after that, something would, you know, remind me of another memory, and I'd jot that down, and pretty soon I had all these folders in my closet with all these bits and pieces in them, and I realized I probably did have enough for a book. So then I began shaping it into a manuscript that I could submit for publication.
Back in the 50s when you were in Kenya, did you have a quiet minute or two once in a while to think, I'm going to write this someday?
No, never even thought of it. It was all in letters, just all letters. I wrote letters every week to both sets of parents. And I didn't even keep a journal.
But the letters
But
came
the letters
back,
were
and that
kind of
was
like a journal.
effectively
Yeah,
almost like
yeah.
a journal.
Well, there are a lot of things that you don't write to your parents. You know, personal thoughts and feelings maybe. But the letters helped me remember a lot of those things.
Did you hide some of the dangers, or if one of the kids got sick, did you maybe?
I minimized them because our parents were very worried anyway about us being there. And as we realized, we would get the Paris Tribune sometimes and Time magazine, and we'd read accounts of things that were happening in Kenya that were nothing like what was really happening. Or it was like, you read about a murder on the streets of New York. Well, that doesn't mean every street in New York, you know, has a murderer lurking on it. But when people far away read about things like that, they think, oh, it's all like that, and it must be really dangerous. So yeah, I minimized the dangers.
I've run into people who are afraid to go to foreign countries that are perfectly safe, forgetting that we live in one of the most violent countries in the planet, full of guns, and we don't think anything of it. Can you tell me about the process? Now, you had some of the letters, and you had notes piled up in the closet. When you decide, what year did you decide to put this into a book form, and what were the steps leading up to the finished book that we see today?
You know, I'm not sure. It was sometime in the 1980s that I started jotting these things down, and I would just write a whole episode, and then, you know, as separate. In fact, they started out like a collection of anecdotes, connected only because they were all about the same place where I was for a period of 2 years. But eventually I decided I had to arrange them in chronological order because it made no sense otherwise. That was kind of the theme. My growth over those 2 years, how ignorant I was and how fearful at the beginning, and how these 2 years changed me, and I needed to tell that in a chronological order in order for that theme to come through. And so that's when I began going back to the letters to see when I did actually go on this safari, or when I started teaching at the Y, and that kind of thing.
Were you surprised that you had some of the memories juxtaposed or in the wrong order in your mind, and having the letters correct them?
Sometimes, yeah, especially, yes. But mostly I had remembered pretty accurately. I don't know, I think when you go to a place that's so different, so foreign, so exotic, it just creates such a clear memory in your head that it sticks there somehow.
So then in the late 80s, you started to arrange the material chronologically. And then how long a process was that?
Oh, till last year. I mean, it was a year ago last summer, the summer of '06, that I decided I was going to really go ahead. I had submitted it a number of times to publishers and had what we writers like to call nice rejections, but nobody bought it. And so I decided that summer of '06 I was going to self-publish it, and then I really went to work on it and did some more revisions, polished it up, and did it. Came out before Christmas.
Using the manuscript
So-
from '97 that was a finalist at Breadloaf
Mm-hmm.
as your base?
Yes, but it changed a lot because I did so many revisions over the years. Many revisions and many reorganization of the material before I finally decided on this chronological order. So,
Can I ask you to pull a section,
Sure.
2 or 3 or 4 paragraphs out of the book that are representative of the material you treat and the style that you treat it in?
okay, I think I will start at the beginning, if that's all right.
Good place, absolutely.
Chapter 1, The Journey Begins. I was 33 years old the first time I flew over Africa. Through darkness so dense the plane might have been hurtling into a black hole in space. When dawn came and the world finally reappeared, the Nile lay far below, a blue thread looping through the desert of southern Sudan before disappearing into the broader blue of Lake Victoria. Soon the Kenya highlands were sliding beneath us, vast farms that seemed to unroll for miles, and Kikuyu villages whose round, whitewashed houses and thatched roofs looked as neat as rows of beehives on the steep green ridges. It was November, and the jacaranda trees were in bloom. Soft clouds of lavender blue floated above the ridges and hollows and over the red-tiled roofs of Nairobi. In a moment, the wheels of the plane would touch down, and my encounter with Africa would begin.
Very nice. Good suspenseful anticipation there at the
Good.
beginning. The plane, of course, this is, what year is this again now?
57,
57, so
Yeah.
this is a
old DC
Prop,
plane,
four-engine?
noisy, yeah.
4-engine,
noisy. Actually, it was an Air France plane, and as I say in the book, I stayed awake all night watching the stewardesses carrying trays of champagne up into the cockpit for the pilots and remembering how people referred to it as Air Chance.
I think pilots for Air France are still allowed to have wine with their lunch during
Yes.
flights.
It was kind of a worry. Yeah.
You arrived in the fall of
We
57.
arrived in November of 57.
November of 57,
Yes.
and you were there for 2 years.
Yes.
Can you tell me something about your evolution of acceptance? And I think from a couple things you've said, your increasing affection for Kenya and Nairobi.
Yes. I went, as I said before, very apprehensive about what lay ahead and not having a clue what it was going to be like for me. And at first, I felt like a displaced person. I had 4 servants. They had taken over all my roles. The only thing I did was chauffeur the children back and forth to school and wander
And you had
around.
three kids.
Yeah.
How
3
old were
kids.
they when
The children
you-
were
in
12,
57?
10, and 2. So the 2 older ones were in school. And followed the servants around trying to learn Swahili. So that it was hard to adjust, because I just felt like I was kind of along for the ride. My husband was doing the real work. But I very shortly became very busy because there was lots of opportunity for volunteer work, and I got into that and became very busy and gradually learned to just love the country, the people. They were so welcoming, so warm, so friendly, and so it was a really wonderful experience. And I think I grew a lot in those 2 years because I learned to take on a lot of things that I didn't know I could do and found out I could.
So you became more independent through your experience in Kenya?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually, I think what changed about me was that I decided that though I loved being a wife and a mother, I was going to be more than that. And when we got home, I went back to school and went back into teaching and became a writer. So it changed me a lot.
You mentioned before the show that you were not an English major in college.
No, history and political science with a science minor.
What switched you from history and political science after your Kenyan experience to wanting to be a writer?
I always liked writing. I always loved it when teachers gave writing assignments in school. I even liked term papers. I just liked the process of writing, but I never pursued it as even a hobby for some reason. I think I just was very busy with other things, and I didn't give it a high enough priority to make space for it. But when I finished my master's degree in 1980 or 81, I think, and I had to take all those required courses, you know, in educational psychology and philosophy of education and so forth, and I thought, I'm going to do something for me now. And I went and took some writing classes at Lesley College, and I've been writing ever since.
So do you regret that psychology and the history and the science? Or
No, because
somebody
they
kind
were
of cajoled you
useful,
into that?
but, you know, they were just things that I had to do, and it was interesting, but it wasn't creative, I guess.
Can you pick another section from the book that describes some of the growth and change that you went through?
I can. It's a pretty long chapter, though I don't think we would have maybe time to do it. Do we have time?
Just maybe a page or two of a sample. We don't have time for a whole chapter.
No. Okay, I'll talk about, I will read a chapter about, it's called Solo Safari. My husband had to fly home because his father died while we were out in Kenya. And I was alone out there with the children. It was August. Nairobi is very cold and gray in August, believe it or not, even though it's near the equator.
Really?
It's high, the altitude is 5,500 feet, and it's quite cool during the cool season. So we had made reservations to go to a hotel down at the coast where it's nice and warm in August. And we wandered around the house, the children and I, feeling very sad. And I finally decided we were going to do this. We were going to go down to the coast, and Bob could join us when he got back. So I set out with the 3 children in the car with my houseman beside me, who couldn't drive, so he wasn't really any help, but he was good company. And I drove us 300 miles through empty bush to the coast.
I'm sure this wasn't a perfectly smooth road.
It was a
either.
dirt road full of bumps and dust, and I don't know where to begin here. Let's see. Well, we left Nairobi and we got down into the part of Kenya where it's very hot and dry and arid, and there is no settlement. There are no settlements, no villages, nothing. Just the road and the empty bush. Tsavo Game Park on either side of the road with lots of big game in it. So that's the kind of environment we were in. As the hours went by, it got hotter and hotter. Sweat poured into my eyes. Blisters began to form on my hands where I gripped the wheel. Kathy and Robbie continued to hang on grimly in the back seat, too hot and dusty and uncomfortable even to argue with each other. Kelly, my 2-year-old, amused herself by singing and talking to her doll. When I looked in the rearview mirror, I could see her lips moving, though I couldn't hear much over the noise of the engine and the whoosh of air through the windows. Slowly, the needle on the gas gauge edged down to empty. There were no petrol stations before the rest stop at Mtito Ande, a tiny pinprick on the map midway to the coast. Around each bend in the road and beyond every slight rise, I expected to see some sign of civilization, but there was none. Only tan plains and stunted thorn trees. Sometimes I glimpsed a baobab tree, huge trunks squatting on the horizon, short twisted branches thrust like aerial roots toward the sky. Ali roused himself and tried to reassure me. "It is coming soon, Memsab, bado kidogo, in a little while." Anxiously, I eyed the gas gauge and scanned the road ahead, glancing at the bush on either side. Earlier in the day, we had met another car every half hour or so, but for the past 2 hours, we had seen none. We were not far from Tsavo, a large semi-arid reserve where in future years poachers would cruelly reduce the populations of great game animals. But in 1958, Tsavo was still known for its huge numbers of elephants, lions, and rhinos. The last thing I wanted was to run out of petrol in this barren stretch of country, well populated with big game. I prayed I wouldn't meet up with a rhino or anything else. Ali and I were, needless to say, unarmed. In the wake of Mau Mau, carrying guns was illegal in Kenya, and anyway, I wouldn't have known what to do with a gun if I had had one. And what would I do if I actually did run out of petrol? The mechanic in Nairobi had assured me I had enough to get to Mtito Ande, but what if he was wrong? How many hours would we have to sit alone and unprotected in this brutal heat before help might come along? What if it got dark and no one came?
Good suspense. I got to ask you, I got to jump ahead. Did you make it?
We made it.
Was
As
it-
we rolled into Malindi, which was our destination, a full moon rose out of the Indian Ocean. The trade winds blew steadily, rustling through the palms. A kind of exultation filled me, not just relief that we had made the trip safely through 300 miles of empty bush. For perhaps the first time I could remember, I had made a completely independent decision, had acted upon it, had successfully carried it out. That night in Malindi, I knew that this day-long safari had left me with a feeling of satisfaction and accomplishment. Ahead lay tea, a bath, then dinner. Life was good.
That's very nice. That's wonderful. That I like the idea in your memoir that you're not only reporting about a place objectively, but you're writing about your own growth, and that is as important as the objective descriptions.
Well,
It
it
seems.
was certainly an important time in my life. Yes, very important.
How's your Swahili?
Basic. I learned enough to get along. The servants knew some, two of the servants knew some English. And I got along, in restaurants and getting directions if we were out on safari. I could do that, but I couldn't really converse on any kind of sophisticated level.
And this is before the
So-
day when in major hotels everybody would speak fairly
Usually
decent English.
In the big hotels, the two biggest ones in Nairobi, most people spoke some English, but not all. Not all. Some of the waiters didn't speak much English, if any. So there were lots of times when you had to find a little kid, who had been to school to interpret for you, because the children were learning English in school, some of them.
Your husband was in the Foreign Service. Was he stationed in other posts overseas after Kenya?
No, we weren't. We went back to Washington, and he was on the Eastern and Southern African desk in Washington for a few years. And then he left government service and went to Syracuse University East African Studies program, where he was an administrator. So
And then
no,
later
we didn't do another overseas assignment with the State Department, but we did go to Tanzania to administer a program for Syracuse University.
And when was that?
That was 10 years later, 1968, 69.
Have you been back to Africa since the 60s?
Yes,
Or,
we
or in
have.
between 58 and
Between
69?
58 and 69, no. But between 58 and 68, no. But since then, several times.
Where do you go? Do you go to Nairobi?
Nairobi, yeah.
Do you still have friends there?
We do, we do. Yeah,
and
we
how-
still keep in touch.
How do you find it as comparison to your first visit?
Well, I'm sorry to say that it was very upsetting to see what had happened. When we went back in 87, 88, President Moi was president, and he had a very corrupt government, and he had drained the country of its resources, and it was just going downhill fast. And in 96, it was even worse. But I'm happy to say that there's a new president now. He was elected in 2002, and things do seem to be looking up for Kenya. So I'm hoping that it will get back on track and become the prosperous and stable country it was for many years.
Do you recommend visiting Kenya to any of our viewers who
Well, I
might
do.
want to go to Africa?
The State Department doesn't. I think they have a do not travel warning, at least they did during
They
the
do.
summer. Yes, but I've talked to other people who have just been there or who are just going there, and they say, no problem. If you go with a tour company, of course, they look out for you pretty carefully. So yeah, I would recommend going, absolutely.
My son travels to Kenya and other African locations frequently, and he feels safer there than he does often here.
I think that's true, and I would certainly encourage people to see it. It's a beautiful country, and the people, they love Americans, so you'd get a good reception.
Where can, I just got the 2-minute signal from Andrew Love. Where can viewers buy Kwaheri Means Goodbye?
It can be ordered on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, It's at Spirit of 76 bookstore in Marblehead, and at Borders Express and Borders, Toad Hall bookstore in Rockport. And it can be ordered from iUniverse, which is the publisher, iUniverse.com.
Okay, so Amazon for people who aren't going to be in Rockport or Marblehead. This is the book that you spoke about last fall at the event at Sawyer Free Library, led by Susan Alexie with other memoirists.
Yes.
Difficult to say.
Yes, there was a panel on writing the memoir.
On writing the memoir. Thank you very much, Dorothy Stevens, for being with us and talking about your memoir of Kenya, Kwaheri Means Goodbye.
Thank you for having me, John.
I want to thank our TV audience, too, for being with us. If you've learned something about how to compile your own experience and write a good story about what created that experience and how you grew through it, then the Writer's Block has done its job. Thanks for being with us, and I hope to see you again next week on the Writer's Block. Good night.